we're going to look at a couple of back-to-back scenarios as we look at the post-resurrection time period of Jesus. So many times we realize Christ raised from the dead, and then we kind of leapfrog over that 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. And that is some of the most precious material we have, because it is proving and justifying by faith and by fact that Christ indeed raised from the dead. Now, again, you have to understand that when you present something like this, someone has to either believe that the Bible is the Word of God or they don't. And so there's always speculation and criticism if they don't believe the Word of God in its entirety, or maybe selectively too. We're going to look at Luke chapter 24, and we're going to pick up in verse 36. Knowing that while we do that, Christ has just walked up the Emmaus Road with those two disciples and taught them a tremendous Bible study about who he is and where he came from and how the Old Testament proclaims who he is, even in his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And so we see that place in Emmaus where Jesus revealed himself. He then steps out of visual range, and we see him coming back into visual range here in verse 36. While they were telling these things, he himself stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be to you." Very important phrase. But they were startled and frightened and thought that they were seeing a spirit. That's why Jesus said what he said. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones, just as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still could not believe it because of their joy and amazement, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it before them. Now this is very important, because first of all, Jesus has to prove he is actually bodily raised from the dead. It's tangible. It's not just a vision. It's not an epiphany, as it's often written off by liberal theological scholars. This is a reality of Christ in a body that can be looked at, that can be touched, and that can be identified as who he is. And it's very interesting because John, when he writes his first letter to the churches, we believe probably in Asia Minor, he starts out the very first verse with this apologetical defense. He says, "What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, and what we have looked at and touched with our hands, concerning the capital W, Word of life," who is Jesus. It's important that he says they saw him, they heard him, and they touched him. And Jesus goes a little step further, because obviously something that is mysterious, mystical, and spiritual only in nature has no need or even ability to consume that which humans would do, or to participate in human activities, one such as eating. And so what does he say? Let me prove it here. And they give him a piece of broiled fish, and they're sitting there going, "Oh my, this is wild. Do we really believe this? Yes, I want to, but I don't know." And he takes the fish and eats it. And apparently that act of eating the fish and seeing it consumed by a tangible body, a resurrected, glorified body, which is the example of what we get when we die, that made a big impression on them. And that was what led John to write the opening verse of his first epistle that we find towards the end of the New Testament. And this is powerful, because Jesus taught them from the scriptures who he was. It's very important. He didn't just say, "Here I am, I'm going to prove it." He goes back into the Old Testament and he teaches them. And we're going to touch on that in our next session.